Well, good evening to those of you on the East Coast and good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast. Just a reminder, as usual, we are a national gathering, so people from all over the country are popping up on the screen in front of you. And welcome to this September 24th edition of Acting for Justice. We are so grateful you could join us. In light of yesterday's events in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, let me open this evening with a prayer by theologian Walter Brueggemann. We come to your presence haunted by an old question. The question is posed by your presence, for we would not ask it otherwise. The question is an old one, asked by our mothers and fathers forever. Haunted because we do not know, and we must know. So now yet again, like all our predecessors, we ask again, is there a balm in Gilead or anywhere? Is there medicine for what ails us? Is there health care with you so absent everywhere else? Is there a drug to deal with our infection? Is there a heavy dose for our pathology? We ask, linger for your answer, but do not know. We ask and then rush to lesser remedies, to quack physicians, to secret recipes, all the while thinking to heal ourselves. But then back to you, still needing your answer. We suspect a yes from you. We ponder the way you healed old slaveries, the way you sent Jesus among the disabled, the way your spirit has surged to heal. We crave a yes from you and wait. We wait midst our disabilities of fear and anxiety. We wait, aware of our pathologies of hate and rage and greed. We wait, knowing too well our complicity in violence we need not see. We cut below that. We wait in weariness, in doubt, in loneliness, and we pray. Say the word and we will be healed. Say the word and our bodies will move to joy. Say the word and our body politic will function again. The agreement tonight was that our speakers would actually introduce themselves as part of their presentation. So all I can tell you is that these are two really nice people. So, Kim and Tom, you are on.
Hi, well, good evening and good afternoon to everyone. And the reason Tom and I wanted to introduce ourselves is, and we'll tell you a little bit of our background, but the most important thing is to talk about our relationship with each other, because we think that's critical to having really difficult and challenging conversations. Currently, I work at Catholic Charities USA. I previously worked at Catholic Relief Services, and that's how I got to know Tom. It's funny about doing these Zoom calls because I can't see his face right now in terms of where he is, but we served on a number of planning committees today together and had a lot of professional conversations about race, about current state of affairs, and that then branched into our personal life, and we've had a lot of conversations off the clock. But the most important thing for me to say, before I kind of wink at Tom and let him say a little bit about himself, is that I think it allowed us to build, I know for a fact, that's why we're here together tonight, allowed us to build a trust where we could really have these conversations. We can really, what we hope to do tonight is model how we kind of struggle and challenge each other and get through this. And hopefully with our vision both set on, how do we build a better world for ourselves, better world for our neighbors, better world for everyone here on this call. So it's really important for us to think about how our shared vision of what a beloved community looks like is one that we're both trying to build together. So I'm going to be quiet for just a second and let Tom speak.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Mulloy. As mentioned earlier, I live and work out of my home in Philadelphia, but I spent 10 years, a little bit over 10 years in DC, working for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, among other organizations, and that's how Kim and I developed our relationship. Kim said a lot of it, was built on trust. It was a process. It's ongoing. for my money, in addition to the trust, and I guess, complementary and sort of dovetailed with the trust is both of our willingness, but mine especially, to be vulnerable, to say things that you might not otherwise have the courage or the desire to say to somebody else, maybe to even a family or a loved one, and B, the willingness to step on rakes and get smacked in the face. I've done that with Kim, and we won't go into those, but I think it's important as we try to model what having a really difficult conversation is on this issue. It's important to acknowledge that there's a little bit of fear and trepidation involved, and that's okay. And we're going to mess up, and we're going to pick each other back up, dust each other off, and continue the journey, because the work is really important, and that's why we do it.
So what we're going to try to do is have a conversation. Tom and I, of course, sat and talked a little bit this morning about what we want to do tonight, but we had talked more than a week ago. And I was in a small group of people who live in Louisville. And of course, I think we're all pausing on what we learned yesterday about the Breonna Taylor case. And I think the most important thing about these conversations, Tom and I have been friends for some years now, and we are still considered colleagues, but we also don't think that we have a pin in where this conversation is, that it's an evolving conversation. It changes by our personal experiences individually, with our friends and family, and with each other, and even how we have conversations together. They're also shaped by what happens in our world. In fact, I think that's a critical part of it, is how we live through things and then how events shape us. So I even think what we initially thought we wanted to talk about tonight, even when last night when the news came out, I already was feeling that I was in a different place and wanted to be honest and candid. I mean, that's the other thing about us being trustful with each other, is that I know I can come to the conversation honestly. So, of course, what I was reflecting on last night and this morning is, what happened with these indictments, and how do I, as a Black woman, feel that somebody's murder wasn't counted as a murder, that the indictment was about people outside of it and feeling invisible. And the reason I bring that up is that I think I wrestle with being very visible. Like I'm being visible to all of you tonight, not just because I'm on the Zoom screen, but I'm putting myself out there and being vulnerable, and when that's important. But I also think in some environments I find myself being very careful, and in fact sometimes trying to take up very little space, trying to be invisible because of my race, knowing that how I may be judged or walk into a situation is how I'll be perceived. And I try to be very careful about that. And the reason I say that, because it's honest, is I also think that's a wrestling. Is, people might even question why that's possible. And I mean, Tom and I've had these questions, but there are times when I've either done things for work or done things personally, and I won't call it a backlash, that's too strong of a word, but there are additional conversations on something that I think went well, that I still get called into, have a conversation about why it went so well. So the first thought in my head is, well, maybe I shouldn't have been so vocal. Maybe I should have not said anything. Maybe I shouldn't have expressed a strong opinion that isn't controversial. Let me be very clear. I'm using the example of something that actually went off very well, was very successful. It was public, and the reviews and surveys about it said it was the best workshop people had attended, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn. But the reason I raised that is that then I was brought into, well, why do you think it went so well? And I'm so surprised it went so well. And I know that in the environment where that happened, my other colleagues who are not Black don't have those circumstances, don't have those conversations. And so it was challenging for me, and it really caused me to, it gave me pause. And Tom is somebody that I talked to about this, because I was even trepidatious going into this. Like, do I want to say as much? Can I be as honest as I want to be? Can I share some of my story? Will that be safe? And it felt safe in the environment I was in, but I realized quickly that it wasn't necessarily safe outside of that environment, that when other people heard about it who weren't in the room, they had lots of questions, and lots of questions about what I said about race, lots of questions what I said about my own feelings, which I don't think, in fact, I know did not contradict church teaching. It was just that, why would you share this much of your personal story? So it's just something that gives me pause, but that's a conversation that I have with Tom to kind of wrestle it out. And even when we wanted to do this conversation, when Jack first called me, I said I'd really like to include Tom, because I think there is something to be said about us having these conversations across racial lines, so we really try to hear and listen to each other. That all being said, we're going to talk about this article, and we'll share a link with you. An article that was in the Washington Post back in June. It was actually, I shouldn't say an article, it was an opinion piece where a gentleman, what he said is when Black people grieve, white people start book clubs. And I say that even with a little chuckle, because when I first saw it in the paper, I was like, well, I have to read this, because it immediately touched me at a place that I thought was really important. And I shared it with Tom, because I said, I think it's important that people read things, but I also want them to know that I'm grieving. So as much as I'm grieving about Breonna and where I was in June, which was, right after we had heard about about George Floyd, but also, there was a whole story about the young man in why am I forgetting it? In New York, in Central Park. Like, those were both upsetting stories. They both occurred on the same day. And for me, they both represented the challenge of walking around with Black skin in this country, or brown skin, that it can be challenged in many different ways, whether by policing authorities or by certain individuals. But that whole conversation, and I was around lots of people who wanted to start book clubs, and that opinion piece gave me pause, and I was glad I shared it with Tom.
Before we come, as Kim said earlier, we sort of turned on a dime, and we had a lesson planned. We had this sort of like distinct sort of like phase one, let's talk about what are the keys to a difficult conversation, and then phase two, try to model a conversation. And this morphed into, well, let's just have that difficult conversation and try to lift up the lessons that we find important along the way. So to the extent that we don't sort of highlight something enough, please ask questions, flag them for Jack, and we'll come back to them. But as Kim and I had this conversation, the first thing that struck me was, it was towards the end of the conversation, was how it began. Because when Kim and I touched base this morning, the first thing out of my mouth was, "Hey, so how you doing?" And I knew what went on. I knew what the country was going through. I knew what had happened. And my, what we usually consider a very innocuous sort of rhetorical, how's it going? What's going on? It rings really hollow when, depending on who you're talking to and when you're talking. And so we had a side conversation about how my language, just to begin the conversation, didn't do a really accurate job of sort of honoring the moment, reflecting sort of what Kim might have been feeling and going and experiencing on a deeper level than really I was or most people were. And I knew that, and I appreciated it, but my words didn't reflect it. But then as we spoke, Kim shared what she shared, and she shared a little bit of it just now, and my question is, and this is, I think this is one of the really important places where we as white people sit, who really want to be helpful, and that is, what do I do with that? How do, if I want to do this work and I can't have those same experiences, But in my work with family, friends, workplace, it's really important to use to I think those voices are important. And so how can I share stories and sentiments like that as a guy that looks like this, right? How do I can I even appropriately honor the pain and the anguish and the stories of you or others in the work that I do? And so I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that. And the answer could be, you can't, right? But where do we go? What do we do? What do I do with that?
Right. And I think that's what makes a difficult conversation, because I think when he first asked that question, the first part of me is like, sometimes my answer is figure it out yourself. Sometimes my answer is, have you thought about this? And sometimes I don't have an answer. And which I think is really confusing is when I'm still sitting in my own silence, because like, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I police myself. I can't say this, I can't say this. And I think that's really important. I think often when we talk about conversations, we're so critically thinking about what we should say, what we should hear, how we should respond. Sometimes it's silence that speaks volumes. And I think that hearing silence, listening to silence it's a really tough social skill, but I think it's a really important skill, because something that I think people do not say is really, really important for us to, if you can play with me with your ears. And in that, what it reminds me of is, Pope Francis has talked to us a lot about encounter. And I want to just share a quote for you, because it's come back to me on this conversation about race, is Pope Francis says, and Tom put it up on a slide so he can share with you. So if I read too quickly or my accent is disturbing, you'll see it. But an invitation to work for the culture of encounter in a simple way as Jesus did, not just seeing, but looking, not just hearing, but listening, not just passing people by, but stopping with them, not just saying, what a shame, poor people, but allowing yourself to be moved with compassion. And then to draw near, to touch, and to say, do not weep, and to give at least a drop of life. And that speaks to me in so many ways, because that whole thing, not just hearing, but listening. And so that's where when I talk about this silence, I think sometimes we have to hear what silence is, even not just seeing, but really, really looking. Sometimes it's not just what's on the surface, but looking deeper and really, it really kind of, really try to understand what's going through that. And when he talks about compassion, that's what we talk about with passion, with somebody. What the root of that word is, that we walk through this with somebody, and that piece about drawing near and to touch, and to not just weep, but to give a drop of life. And I'm not saying you can't cry with me. Sometimes I need people to cry with me, or at least be able to sit with me when I cry. And that drop of life, I'm not asking for a drop of blood, but I'm asking for somebody to sit with me, to hear me, to think about how we do change. How do we think about things? So sometimes when the response isn't clear about what should I do, what can I do, sometimes I need somebody to come out of themselves to help me think about what their next steps are, because they may not be the next steps for me. I think that's what's really important, is that this two-way street is, there's some things I can and cannot do. There's some things Tom can and cannot do, but how do we help inform each other about things that he can do as a white man that I just can't do, and that things that he can say that other people will hear very differently than coming out of my mouth. Even people I think who really respect me and really love me, I have been in meetings where Tom will say something, I'm like, did somebody else just say that? But they hear it from him. And I think, there are ways for us to use our access, our relationships with people. There are relationships that I have that I can use in ways that other people can't use. This will not sound comical, and I don't mean it to. I have a very dear friend. We've been friends for 15 years. She lives north of me in Washington, D.C. And once a week, we walk down to Black Lives Matter Plaza, which the street has been painted near the White House. And there always is a huge police presence down there. And we that her job down there is to make sure I get out of that area unharmed. And then when we get to my neighborhood, and my neighborhood is not quote unquote a bad neighborhood or whatever. It's a neighborhood. But that I know the people who live in my neighborhood. And if there's trouble here, my job is to protect her. That we both have a role in our friendship, of course, but we also have a role where we are geographically, where we are in place. And so I think that I'm not saying that I have taken all of Pope Francis's words and used them, but I've really been reflecting on them for some time now. But how do we draw near? How do we have proximity to somebody? How do we take a different page and sometimes be quiet ourselves to hear what they're saying, to see what they're seeing, and to really try to deeply understand what they're going through in a way that can be transformative, not just for ourselves, but for our community. I
should have had this quote. I should have had this quote on the ready, but what you just said about there are things that you can say that I can't, and things that I can say that you can't. Reminds me of the King quote that I'm going to butcher. You may get it better, but this
is also says, part of our dynamic. When he butchers something, I'll find him about it and send it to him verbatim. Go.
But in where do we go from here? King makes this comment about black hands or black folk hold one key, but white folk hold the other key. Is there something? It's something. The idea that this work has to go hand in hand, and for what so for white folks to try to rely on black folk to explain racism to them is not the way to go, and but there is necessarily a right and proper role and voice for both, and it's got to be work. So where did I go right? What is do you?
I won't be able to put it back to you, but I'll send it to you. No, but and when Tom says that, one of the things that we talked about is believing stories, like that we do have to work on this, but it's also believing and hearing each other. And so I wanted to share a story that is a painful story for me, and it's my own personal story. I sometimes have shared a story about my nephew, but as I mentioned earlier, I've worked for the church for a number of years. I worked for a Catholic Relief Service, so I've combined worked for the Catholic Church 15 years, but have been a cradle Catholic, and that's critical to this story. I was at an event probably back in, I'm going to say 2008. It's been some time now. And somebody approached me and they asked me if I was Catholic, and I said yes. And the first time she asked, I just answered the question. I moved on. She came back around and asked me again, and I said yes. And she said, so when did you convert? And I said, well, I didn't really convert. I was baptized as an infant. And so she said, okay. Now, I didn't see her for a whole year. Saw her the next year. She asked me if I was Catholic again. And I informed her, indeed, I was Catholic. And then we went through the whole thing again, that I was baptized as a child. And then she asked me, where was I baptized? And also, just to help tie loose ends into the story, my father was in the military, so he moved every 3 years. So I'm one of those great kids who was baptized in one church, received reconciliation and First Communion in another parish, and then was confirmed in Germany and just all over the place. So I told her the name of the parish, which was Holy Name of Jesus and the Archdiocese of San Francisco. And she kind of looked at me and said, really? I'm really surprised by that. Now, remember, I lived in San Francisco till I was about 3 or 4. I couldn't imagine why she was surprised. And it's not show and tell, but I am going to hold it up for everybody to see. So then in 2017, so this conversation has been going on for a couple of years, I got a copy of this, which is a copy of my baptismal certificate. This is, as you'll notice, there's a crease in it. This is not the one that my mother has had in her Bible for 50 years. So this woman went and requested an official copy of my baptismal certificate, then sent it to me with a letter about my godparents, and a lot of information that I assumed she didn't think I knew. But what struck me on so many different levels is that she really didn't believe I was Catholic, so she had to prove it to herself, and then also let me know that she'd proved it to herself. But then, I was offended on behalf of my mother, who is better at attending church than I am, that she wouldn't save something as important of her child, and that she didn't think my parents had selected godparents that we know, because she was a very long letter detailing what had happened to my godparents. They both have passed away. It was at my godmother's funeral. I did not make it to my godfather's funeral because I was living outside the country at the time. But then she explained that the parish that I was baptized in did not have a lot of people of color, did not have African Americans, did not have, she said it still has maintained to be a very Asian and white parish. And I realized all what was happening is she still needed to confirm that I could have been baptized at that church. And it's one of those painful stories, because I would think, why would I lie about where I was baptized? So believe it or not, I'd only had shared this story with Tom recently. And, he had this kind of incredulous response like, what? You're kidding. And in fact, kind of why I don't think I showed it to him the last time I told him about this. That's why I showed it to all of you. But it was just a shock and surprise that she felt the need to go request it. And we can get into whether or not why the Archdiocese allowed her to have an official copy. I mean, it's got a seal and everything on it. But why she felt it so necessary to prove to herself, and I guess consequently prove to me that I was indeed baptized in the Catholic Church. And that's just one of those things that makes it tough to kind of continue to do this work with faith and fervor, because I really do trust our church. I really believe in the gospel. I really believe in Catholic social teaching. And yet that's a moment that gives me pause and thinks, maybe I shouldn't be doing this,
When, like Kim said, when she shared that story with me, I was floored, incredulous, to say the least. It was literally unbelievable to me that somebody would do that. But the thing is with that story is it is one of many stories that Kim has shared with me over the years that have literally been unbelievable. I could not conceive of it happening. Like, when I say unbelievable, I'm not using unbelievable in the colloquial sense. I'm using it in the very technical. I had difficulty believing that this happened because as a white man, no one has ever questioned my Catholicism. Kim and I were sharing some drinks one evening a couple years ago, and the bartender was another Black woman, and as Kim and I got into one of our conversations that's happened over the years, we roped in this bartender, and they told me about stories, and they told me stories about the trouble that many Black women have with doctors and healthcare providers, and being second guessed when they present with health issues, or when they report certain feelings or pains, aches, and whatnot. I can't remember, it was Kim or the bartender made the comment that Serena Williams almost died post childbirth because the doctors literally were not listening to her. They just did not believe what she was saying. And again, it was literally unbelievable to me, because as a middle-aged white man, I have gone through life never second-guessed by a healthcare professional. I walk in, I tell the doctor what I'm feeling, what's going on. It's taken seriously, and those stories pile up and have weighed on me because I've heard them from Kim, I've heard them from others. When I was in, when I did Just Faith, when I co-facilitated a Just Faith class after I participated, and one of our guest speakers who was a close acquaintance of mine, somebody that I knew pretty well. My co-facilitator and I invited him in to give our presentation, and to give a presentation on race and the history of race in the Catholic Church. And he made an offhand comment that he's a black man, and his current house has a covenant on it. And it floored me that in whatever that was, 2014, 2015, that covenant still existed, and they were on the deeds of houses owned by black folk. And this is one of those really important lessons for me in the work that we do and that I do, is that a lot of what I hear and a lot of what we hear when we really listen to Black voices, like Kim was saying earlier, not just hear, but really listen, could quite possibly be literally inconceivable to you, unbelievable, because what is being said you've never experienced it, you've never seen it, you've never even fathomed that it could be a thing. But those stories are out there. They're extraordinarily painful. It takes an immense amount of courage to share them, and so the one lesson that I take from that is we have to, if we're going to be real allies, we have to seek out those stories, really listen to them, and then believe them. Because they do sound unbelievable to a lot of folks who didn't grow up being watched by the security guard every time they walked through the store, or pulled over just to be pulled over. If we're going to do this work, we have to start believing. We have to start listening and honoring that pain and those experiences, rather than meet them with incredulity and, "Are you sure that really happened?" Because that's where I think real work and real change is going to take place, when we can really encounter, as Kim was saying earlier.
And Tom and I also, just getting ready for this, we looked at a document that was posted for you guys called 8 Tips for Confronting Racism with Your Friends and Colleagues. And 2 really stood out to me, and they're actually sequential. It's 2 and 3, which is seek clarification. And I think that's so important. And I, even what I was telling Tom is, it's not even clarification about the question, like, did that really happen, or how did it happen? Sometimes I think we want to be clear in the language we use. And I think that's tough when you're friends. You're trying to be funny sometimes because you're trying to lighten the mood. But I think clarification is really critically important. And the other piece about explaining why the behavior causes harm, even the story I just shared, I think for most of us on this call, at least I hope it is, it's obvious why that behavior caused harm. But sometimes you're not going to be able to explain that to the person that caused the harm. So sometimes that's when I need an ally. That's when I need somebody like Tom or somebody else to just listen and sit with me. And of course, more affirming sometimes when they're even more upset than I am. Sometimes I sit there and I begin to think that maybe something's wrong with me. Like maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm overreacting. Because that's another thing that I also want to, I want to get away from the trope that, I'm trying to be honest. Like people talk about Black women being very angry and they're very sensitive. So I try to guard on that, which means I can't be my authentic self. So I hope that with my allies, that when I'm really angry, when I'm upset, when I am miffed, I'm surprised I still have this, because when I did get this copy of the baptismal certificate, I really wanted to set it on fire and tear it. But I saved it so I have proof that this craziness happened. So when I tell the story, I can say, here it is. Like, I didn't make this up. I have the postmarked envelope, so I can even say, this just arrived within recent time. This didn't arrive, in the 60s when I was baptized. But it's just so important that, and I think it's on both sides. I'm not saying that all pain is caused But I also, and I'm not apologizing for myself or for anyone else, I think sometimes maybe Black people do cause white people pain because we're so angry that I also think help also understand where the source of that anger is. And sometimes it may come out at you, but it may be directed at the person who, decided she needed to prove that I was Catholic, if that makes any sense.
I don't know. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, so please have us.
I'm watching. I know we're getting close to 8, but
speed up or
maybe speed up a little bit. But go.
So Kim referenced this earlier, a Washington Post piece that we found really valuable and that we've kept coming back to over the last couple events that we've done together, and over the last couple conversations that we've had. And so we want to share a couple quotes from that because it does highlight, really hones in really on a couple of these issues that we've been talking about.
And Tom, while you pull that up, I noticed. I know I'm not supposed to be worried about questions, but I see things. I know somebody asked for it. We're going to make sure that Jack has the link, so when you guys get your follow-up email, you'll be able to access. Mm-hmm. We're going to encourage you guys to read it. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. And so this first quote that we want to lift up and sort of and unpack a little bit is like really hones in on what we've been talking about. And so I do want to read it. It's long and it's wordy, but we do feel that it's really worth it because of the sentiment shared. Do you want to read, or you want me to?
I'm going to give it to you.
Okay. Trey Johnson, the writer in the Washington Post, he says the confusing, perhaps contradictory advice on what white people should do probably feels maddening. To be told to step up, no step back, read, no listen, protest, don't protest, check on Black friends, leave us alone, ask for help, or do the work. It probably feels contradictory at times. And yet, you'll figure it out. Black people have been similarly exhausted, making the case for jobs, freedom, happiness, justice, equality, and the like. It's made us dizzy, but we've managed to find the means to walk straight. And so, it just dawned on me as I was reading this. I didn't see this when it was originally posted, but to go along with the theme of the evening, I really took a chance one day, like probably shortly after this was printed, because I think it was pretty recent, and I said to Kim, here's where I am with some some things, and I really need your help. And that is, I read a lot of contradictory advice. I mean, you read an article about somebody, and you read an article from somebody, it says one thing, and then a tweet from a really respected voice seems to say the exact opposite. And Kim said, "Oh, I think I have what you need," and she shared this article because it is. If you've been doing this work long enough, and if you really care about this work, you've probably felt this same sentiment. Where do I go? What do I like? Am I supposed to go to the protest, or am I not supposed to go to the protest? Am I supposed to read the book, or do I not read the, like, what, where? And so we want to lift this up because it's to say, like, yes, it's a thing. Yeah. There's not a one-page flyer on how to do anti-racism. Like, even though we're all sometimes clamoring for that. The football season just started, and so you'll see many times, like, the quarterbacks at the end of the play, they'll go to their hand and they'll whip it up and they'll rip up their pad on their arm. You can't see my arm, their pad on them, and they have their cheat sheet. They have their plays. They have their plays written on something on their arm, and so they'll know. And I think we clamor for that a lot. We clamor for the easy, if that then sort of flow chart to dealing with this work, and it's not easy. We don't have the plays that we can go to depending on the situation. What we have is a lot of pain and confusion, and we have to honor that and sort of like roll with it. And so that's what Kim and I have been doing.
So I'm noticing, Jack. So there's a couple things we want to do, and I know we're pressed for time. I just want to respond to this because I do think there have been times where I don't really want to talk about it. And even the conversation I had with somebody, I said, let's treat it. And I just will put it out here just because otherwise I just, being honest, I have a brother who passed away in March. And so there are days where I really wanted to talk about it. I wanted somebody to listen to everything I wanted to say about my brother. And the other days people would call and be like, I wanted to check in on you. I don't want to talk about it. I think some of this work, especially when there are really distinct interruptions in our lives, like, George Floyd's murder or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, when those things happen, I think sometimes we don't always have words. Tom and I have had a lot of conversations where I'm like, I can't be articulate right now. I can't figure it out. But I think as we do in any relationship, sometimes people meet us exactly where we need to be met, and sometimes they have to come a little bit further, and sometimes we have to push them away. So just this dizziness, I just encourage all of us to stick in it, and I think that we will kind of eventually walk straight. So since we're pressed for time, and I'm just going to try to move Tom and us along, but I want to go to the other quote just because I think we want to talk about acknowledging the moment and what we do kind of moving forward. And because I made Tom read the last quote, I'll read most of this. But we really talked about what we want to say. So I'll read this part, and I'm not going to read the first part. I'm going to start at the right acknowledgement of Black justice, humanity, and freedom, and happiness won't be found in your book clubs, your protest signs, your chalk talks, or your organizational statements. It will be found in your earnest willingness to dismantle systems that stand in our way, be they at your job, in your social network, your neighborhood associations, your family, or your home. It's not just about amplifying our voices, it's about investing in them, in our businesses, in our education, in our political representation, power, housing, and art. I just think that it seems overwhelming because it is. I mean, this work is so difficult because it's so entrenched in our system, in our lives, in our communities. And so for us to change it and make it different, for our voices to be heard that we haven't heard before, we have to change a lot of what's very comfortable. And I think that's humans, that's just tough. I mean, I have ways I like to do certain things. And when I have guests or I'm home with family, I'm like, why are they doing it that way? But I think sometimes you have to kind of take your hands off the wheel and just say, let them do that. One thing I'm thinking, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Tom, is for many, many years, like 8 years after I finished Just Faith, my commitment was to do work with young people in the community because I love teenagers. And I was teaching them how to cook. And the biggest challenge for me to teach somebody how to cook, because I'm a pretty decent cook, is to not do anything. Like to ask them 20 times, because these are teenagers, did you read the recipe? Did you read the recipe? And they dump all the powdered sugar in the bowl, and I'm like, did you read the recipe? Because they're getting ready to make frosting, and then they put some of the fat in, and of course they turn on the mixer and everything goes everywhere, and it's a big mess. That's going to happen. But if I always feel like I have to be the one guiding and teaching and doing, then nobody gets to learn, and we don't get to come together. And so that's the piece I'm going to leave for cooking, and then I'm going to turn over to Tom. And I know we're at time, but Tom, I'll give you the last word.
Okay. The last word that I want to say, and this is, I think, a real action step that I try to take, and so it's an action step that I want to leave everybody with. But earlier in the article, Mr. Johnson talks about microaggressions. And at the top of the quote, he said, it's not just police killings. It's in these choices that we make. It's in our social and professional networks. It's in the microaggressions and the slights that happen at dinner parties. And it dawned on me as I reread this article I've come back to this article again and again, that microaggressions they have a cumulative power, and that's why we recognize their potential for harm in this work that we do. But what's sort of not acknowledged is the individual microaggressions and the fact that they're microaggressions, but they're harmful because of that cumulative effect. And so one of the things that I do is if I can flip that thinking, I try to do two things, and that is, A, push back against microaggressions when I hear them. There's been, I can look back on my time and pinpoint sometimes where I've let things go and they really should have been addressed. Whether it be somebody casually using a racial epithet in a softball dugout, which has happened to me, because you'd be amazed what guys surrounded by other guys think they can get away with. Or the reference to something. I'm trying to do a better job of stepping up and not letting that go, because if we can do micro persuasion or something along those lines, like if we can take an opening in a conversation with a family member to say, gee, I read an article that was just floored me, and because of X, start building up our own sort of pile of micro persuasions. Maybe that's one thing that we can do to sort of have a cumulative effect for the good rather than the microaggressions for the bad. So that's one thing. And I do want to a shout out to the article that Kim mentioned earlier. We're using the term microaggression, but one of the pieces that I really appreciated from Dr. Lott's 8 tips was really trying to avoid loaded language. Those words that really, there is language that is used that does shut down debate, and maybe steering away from those words like supremacy, like white fragility, like microaggressions. If it's not going to be helpful, then just don't use the language. And so loaded language can really be harmful. And so I guess we'll leave there, and then maybe we can cover some of the other stuff that we had to cut in questions and answers.
Great. Well, and I don't really want to cut you off at all, except we got so many great questions, and I'm intrigued and interested in how you would respond to some of these. The first, I packaged a couple of questions together, and I'm going to ask the first one and then follow up with the second one. But the first one is fairly poignant. One of our participants tonight writes this, and I'm quoting: "As a Black person, with all that's going on now, I find myself being unwilling to trust white people much. I watch my words with them more than I used to. Is this unfair?"
I hear you loud and clear. And I say this, and not to make Tom feel any better about himself, because most of the time I try to cut him down at the knees. But Tom, I can name the people that when it is this ridiculous, I don't know any word for it. I mean, I am in a really, this year has just been horrible, right? Tom is one of the people I can trust to talk to. I know I told you where I worked. I don't know if anybody where I work is on the phone or on the call, but I'm less open with some people at work. I've had some interesting responses to things that I've said. I'm not going to repeat them, but some of them where I literally get off the phone, and Tom has heard what some of these responses have been, where I just literally have to sit for like a half an hour because I can't believe somebody just said what they said. So I hear the whole distrust, and that's why I think when I even started, I really emphasized how much I built trust with Tom over the years. And I say that because I have other white friends, and my best friend for many years, we've been friends since I was 15. She's somebody I can talk to. But even people I really, really trust, it's been tough. And I don't know if it's right or wrong. I don't know if there is a right or wrong. You have to feel how you feel. And I think it's a paramount thing to be able to be with people you can trust. I mean, I'm not saying we can't trust them, but I think it's a two-way street. Like, the people that want to be trusted by us have to also work to earn that trust. Tom just gained that trust overnight. I mean, there have been some really tough conversations, and both of us kind of pushing each other. And I think when you can't push someone or be really honest with them and tell them where the pain is, I think that's tough. So what I'm saying is I completely understand why you're untrusting right now or unwilling to have conversations with people. And I hope a true ally shows up for you. Because the most frightening piece is if allies don't show up for us, because I feel like right now, if we don't have allies, then we really feel like there's no hope. And I don't want to leave saying that. I don't want that to be my last thing I say on this session, that there's no hope. But somebody asked me something on Saturday, and I felt pretty hopeless. I didn't have anything inspired or hopeful to say.
Thanks, Kim. The follow-up question is sort of tied to it, which there's a bunch of questions that all sort of fit into this category. And the question is something like, how in the world do I meet a Black person that I can have a conversation with? And Kim, I'm just going to toss out, among other things, just this idea that white people need to put themselves in Black spaces. So the accident of a relationship might happen. Anyway, you feel free to riff off of that or go in any direction. And Tom, you too.
Right, and I'm actually going to toss it to Tom first, if you're okay with that, just because he knows why I'm doing it.
This is actually one of the topics of conversation that Kim and I that Kim and I have had. It's not easy, especially now in this COVID era where we barely get a chance to see our friends and loved ones, more or less set up really try to put ourselves in places where we're gonna meet strangers and be uncomfortable. So it's not easy, and so. One of the things that I think we discussed was, while you may not be able to do it now, you can plan for it for a time when those opportunities become available. And I know there are parishes across the country in dioceses that have started twinning and just trying to go to mass together or share a meal together, or share like an evening function together. So trying to plan for a time where you can reach out to a parish that might, in your diocese, that might be over in that part of town where there's a predominantly Black or maybe even Latino population, so that's one idea, is to start planning to build those parish-based relationships. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I mean, the challenge is, of course, COVID-19, but even some of you may go to a coffee shop locally. Maybe you have to go to a different neighborhood. Like, really branch out, really think about different communities. And it's just like, I mean, in that quote that I read about supporting Black businesses, supporting Black arts. And I don't want it to be superficial. I don't want you to show up at the Black coffee shop because, I want to meet Black people. But how do you engage in a way that is true to you? I mean, this is, again, it has to, if it's not your honest self coming forward, then it's going to feel weird. Like, if and I'll use myself as example and bad humor, but like if somebody's coming in, Kim, I want to talk to you. They don't even know my name, but they're kind of waving to me. I'm immediately going to be looking around like, why?
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm at an event or I'm at a place where, it's the simple thing of smiling and saying hello. And I realize right now that's not the best option, but really thinking about the spaces we all inhabit and how we inhabit them and how we interact with people. And it may be you change ever so slightly what you do, but the other thing is if it's what are the other congregations nearby? We also can learn a lot from our you may or may not be Catholic. So what is the local AME church doing? What is the local Baptist church doing? What are the other congregations that if you go to a predominantly white parish, who else can you work with or talk to? And again, I know that this time that we're in now, where it's socially distanced, is really, really tough to have these important conversations where I think you need to be a little bit closer than 6 feet because you really want to talk about things. But really begin to think, and if you're on the parish social ministry team or any of the ministries in your parish, how do you begin to even some of the things that you are doing at COVID? If you guys are doing meals for families or that sort of thing. Can you join with another congregation and do those things together and begin to work with each other to know how to do things? But it's reaching out beyond what's I'm struggling with using the word comfortable, but I'm going to say the word comfortable. But in order to have a conversation or build a relationship with it, you have to be proximate. It has to take time. Tom and I didn't start having these conversations the first time we met. It was over time. It's a relationship and a conversation that has evolved over of a fair amount of time,
Yeah. In fact, I would even add that our relationship didn't start when you were at Catholic Charities. You were at Catholic Relief Services when we had, and you worked in the international development realm, and I did domestic policy. So we had even less professionally to talk about. And I can't remember how it might have been just, talking at CSMG about the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, I'm sorry, about, any sort of what we're doing, what the workshops are, or something along those lines. So like Kim said, yeah, don't expect to jump into the deep end and overnight, but reach out.
And the last thing I will say, as somebody who inhabits a lot of predominantly white spaces, is also when you walk into a room where do you choose to sit? I mean, it's when we look at hiring practices, we look at all the things that need to change, it's mostly because people gravitate to what they're most familiar with. So how do you change that up a little bit? And if somebody's in the same space you're in, there's something you probably have in common with them.
Tom, this is probably a question for you. I got enough questions about it that I thought we should just clarify it quickly. When you were talking about inviting your friend into your Just Faith group, you talked about, and the word you used was covenants, and some people didn't understand what that was a reference to. You want to just explain that quickly? Oh,
sure. Yeah. So they're still around. They're not enforced, obviously. But back in the day, not too long ago, mid 20th century, early 20th century, we're talking about the 1900s, early 1900s, there were clauses. What?
I was just saying, even into the 50s and 60s.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. There were clauses on deeds to houses that prohibited the sale of that house to a person of color. And so and that was, we could have a whole separate workshop on how systemic disinvestment and systemic racism has caused persistent inequities in poverty and opportunity. And this is one of them, because as most of us probably know, the number one way that the vast majority of families build wealth in America and transfer wealth to future generations is through the ownership of property. And when a whole class of people was systematically denied home ownership in certain places, and then to add insult to injury, offered substandard or suboptimal terms on their mortgage in other places to compound the issue, really begin to understand why we have a housing crisis on our hands. But that's what a covenant was. A covenant was a clause in a deed to a home that prohibited the sale to a family of color, to a person of color.
And Tom, one of our participants tonight writes that a great book to read about this is called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So anybody interested in reading more about that, look up The Color of Law. Kim, a question that came directly to you through me is, in light of the fact that you've experienced this phenomenon of white people just not believing you, like even where you're baptized. I mean, it's not like, where did you rob a bank? I mean, where did you get baptized as a baby or something? But, what's the well of hope that you're drawing from? How do you stay in the game here? Why not become cynical and just disengaged? What's tugging you?
So I always say this. I say that even on the worst day in the world, I was blessed with. I wish everybody could meet my mother. She's amazing, and she's always kept me grounded with a sense of humor and a sense of faith. And I don't mean that tritely. She's really salt of the earth. I was blessed that God chose me to be her daughter. But I have amazing siblings, and I have formed amazing friendships. I have people in many different places that support me, and there are people who I call and I'm like, I need you to listen to this. So I am blessed with really amazing people, and I count Tom among that group. I mean, I know that some people don't have people they can go to, and believe you me, there are days where I really literally am like walking out of a building saying, well, that might be the last day I work for the church. But there are so many dedicated people that support me, that support the work, and I've had an opportunity to see both work here overseas and here in the United States that people are doing that I really feel lives out our call to be people of the gospel. And I think it's incredibly important work. So that's my long and short answer. And yet it's frustrating, but I as one dear friend told me years ago, and she is Jewish, you know, if you don't do it, who will? And knowing what you know, do you trust all those people to do it? I don't think I'm high and mighty like that, but I think that be continuing to work with each other, for all of us to be on this call and this Zoom session tonight means we're all trying to still move forward. We all still believe, even after a night like last night, that we can build this dream. We can build this community that John Lewis spoke about, that, you know, Martin Luther King spoke about, that even Malcolm X spoke about. And I'm using Black people, but I think that there's a real belief that we are better than this. We can do better, and so we shall.
Thank you. And I'll make this the last question, and I'll make it a little bit more, it's an easy question, I guess. In both of your experiences, is there a best church document, I'll say it that way, that you would recommend for our participants tonight? A best, and it doesn't have to be from one particular denomination or another. It can be whatever you're most familiar with. There's also a few comments, kind of discontent with what church statements there have been. So I just put that in the background, that some people on our call tonight are not exactly happy with the absence of some really poignant, powerful statement on race. But with that said, anything that you would recommend that people read if they haven't already?
Such a good question. And I love the silence that we're both having as I'm trying to talk into one with an answer. But go ahead, Tom.
Seitz's pastoral was, I think it was stronger than some of the other pastorals. So Bishop Seitz in El Paso, and I'm gonna blank on the title, but it was like night will be no more. Is that what it?
Yeah,
something along those lines.
Like that, right?
Anyway, Bishop Seitz in El Paso, his pastoral statement, I thought had a lot to commend it. It was stronger.
Go ahead. Still yet to see it. But go ahead, Tom. I know we're asking for things that people should be reading, and
we want to start a book club. That's what we're looking for here.
Well, you know, the bishop's pastoral is I think a lot of ink has been spilled on it after the fact, but it you know, to a certain extent, it can be what you make it. And you know, if you want to talk about, you know, use the pastoral statement, but don't stay within the four corners of the pastoral statement. Like, okay, the pastoral statement talks about exploring systemic racism and names systemic racism as an evil. That's a great thing for people who want to call into question Catholics, who want to call into question the presence of systemic racism. okay, well, the pastoral statement does that. It calls out systemic racism, and it says racism is more than just a personal thing. It's systemic, it's institutional. So build from there, use that toehold to build a bigger sort of conversation. I think that would be one suggestion that I could.
I mean, I and somebody just messaged me, but it was a thought coming in my head is Brian Mazyck wrote about the church and racism. His book is very powerful. I think I love what Tom said, and what I think is also it's what Just Faith has taught us, is what some of us experienced in our college or high school education, is how do we also look at something critically, like embrace it and use it for his teaching, but also I think we have to continue to ask hard questions. And I think that's an important place for us to be, is what questions aren't being addressed, what things should be in here, how do we build out of that? Our faith is reflective of where we're supposed to go. And, where Jesus took it in terms of the gospel, in terms of all the things he said and who he worked with, I mean, people were challenged by who he talked with, how he ministered, and how he did his life. How can we be challenging in that way to speak about racism in our communities and in our parishes? And the pastoral and our Catholic social teaching, the compendium, and all those things as guidance. I'm not going to read everything, but I do think that you could read that pastoral and then have it be, I don't think it has to be a toll, but I think it can guide you and really expand, well, what else do we need to be thinking about? What are we experiencing here in our parish or in our diocese?
Thank you.
Archbishop Gregory has also said some really strong and powerful things. Archbishop Gregory gave a talk when he was still the Archbishop of Atlanta here in Philadelphia on racism, and there was some really powerful stuff in there. I don't know if there's a video, but if you can find the transcript or even some of the writing, some of the reporting that was done on it, like Archbishop Gregory really knows how to talk, speak truth to power. Like he's a amazing man. So look for some stuff that Archbishop Gregory has said in the recent past as well.
Well, thanks. Well, Kim and Tom, thank you so very much. We have a little tradition here on these calls that we're not going to unmute anybody because it just becomes pandemonium, but we will clap for you silently. So if you look into the screen, we all want to thank you for being with us tonight. And I tell you, the pleasure of tonight for me was it just makes me hungry to have a kind of relationship that the two of you have. As difficult, I don't want to underplay how much it takes, how much work it takes, but still, it's just so appealing. And I thought of a quote that I thought I would close us with tonight. Thinking of your presence with us tonight is kind of an invitation to think about what could a next chapter of my life include. So here's the quote that I'd like to share with everybody. It comes out of actually a non-religious, non-spiritual book called Improvo, which is about improvisation. But there's a quote that I just love because I think it has everything to do with the human spiritual adventure. And it goes like this. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who like to say no and those who like to say yes. And those who like to say no are rewarded with the security that they seek. And those who like to say yes are rewarded with the adventures that follow. So, everybody, thanks for being with us again tonight. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. You'll get some information about what that event will look like, as well as a follow-up email from Leela that will include the notes from Kim and Tom and anything else that follows up. So, thanks again. God bless and good night.